Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. An observer once said of our turbulent city, it'll be a great town once they get it finished. The truth, of course, is that New York is a great town, partly because it will never be finished. It's a city that has regularly been battered, doubted, cursed, and loathed, only to battle its way back to glamour. That description comes from a new book, this book, Magnetic City, a walking companion to New York. Much more than a Baedeker, Magnetic City tells lively tales that help us understand why the city is the way it is. Its author is Justin Davidson, Pulitzer Prize winner and architecture critic of New York Magazine. He has fascinating stories to tell. Next. Justin Davidson, it's a delight to have you on the program. By the way, this man is a multi-talented writer who also has the title of classical music critic at New York Magazine?
Yes, that's right.
So you stay busy writing music and architecture and city observations, and we're glad that you do. It's fun to read you. You grew up in Rome. I'm wondering how that experience perhaps informed how you take in cities.
I think it was totally formative. I mean, partly because I was really free to roam and bike around the city. So I think that desire, and people would come and visit, so I'd take them around. That desire to move around the city, to look, even as a kid, that was really formative. And then, I had people who helped me see what there was, to help me to understand that the city I was living in was the product of so much stuff that had happened before. I had a teacher who would, take me to a street corner. He taught art history and urbanism. And, he would say, look at the street corner and tell me what you see, and then tell me why it is that way. And that question, what does it look like and why is it the way it is kind of fundamental to the way I think about the city.
And what better place to do that than Rome, where every corner is, on every corner you can see, a classic work of art, almost every corner.
Yeah, but the thing that really, I think, formed my idea of a city is that, we think of it as a fairly unchanging place now, right? You go, you visit it, you come back 25 years later, looks exactly the same kids are hanging out on the same motorbikes in front of the same cafes.
The eternal city.
Yeah, and the eternal kids on the motorbikes.
Right.
But the reality is that until relatively recently, it was changing all the time, just the same way New York does. And so what you see is this accumulation of layers and the kind of irreverence that goes with that. Stuff was put up, torn down, stones were used in another building, doors were moved, windows were closed up, streets were realigned, and all of that stuff leaves you with a tremendously rich and layered city, one that, is a record of all the people who've lived there and manipulated it and been through it. And that's kind of the way I look at New York, which is not just the way it is, but this sense that every corner has in it its own kind of history, its relationship to the rest of the city, and all the people who've flowed through and wanted different things from it and imposed different ideas on that corner and, have an idea of how the future is going to be.
And that palpable in your book. Let's talk about it, starting with the title. Why Magnetic City?
I mean that almost literally, in the sense that it is a city that pulls people of all different kinds and from all over the world. And people come here for so many different reasons. Immigrants come here with nothing to make a new life the way they always did. Billionaires come here because, they want to spend a little time or park some money or, do some business. But for every reason, professionals, visitors, tourists, relatives, there's this constant flow of people through the city. But more than that, I think that because it's been in books and on TV and in the movies so much, even people who've never been here not only have an idea of what it is, which is actually pretty detailed
Sure.
and sophisticated, but they also have something invested in it. It's their city too, in a way. I think people feel a sense of ownership about it, and they have a relationship that extends, across thousands of miles of distance.
I've experienced that. I mean, I'm a New Yorker. I was born in the Bronx. Not rare, but occasional times that I see a tourist, maybe with a map, and I stop and say, "Can I help you get somewhere?" and have a little conversation. And I'm from Ohio, I'm from Iowa, I'm from Idaho. I love your city. Now, I suppose if I said, get the hell out of my way, I'm walking here, maybe I wouldn't get the same reaction. But yeah, that investment in the city seems to be widespread.
I think that one of the things I've experienced about first moving to New York and then living here basically my whole adult life is that really to be a New Yorker, all you really need to do is show up. And if you're here, you're immediately part of the city. And there isn't really, the way there is in so many other cities, a set of concentric circles of belonging where like the people in the center are the real members of the club and everybody else is sort of, at increasing distances, which is the way it works in a lot of places. And here that's really not true. There are a lot of little worlds that are separate. Some of them overlap, some of them collide. But the sense that you can participate in civic life and in the life of the city, and that you're contributing something to that life as soon as you arrive, is something that, if it's not unique to this city, is really quite special.
Your remarks about looking at a corner or a building or something and not only seeing what's there, but trying to figure out why it is the way it is, the clues that you're unearthing about our past, reminded me of something Agatha Christie said once. She said, "It's ridiculous to set a detective story in New York City. New York City is itself a detective story."
That's very well put. It's true. There is a reason for almost everything. If there's a sign above a store, chances are there's another sign beneath it. And when you take that sign off, something pops up and you realize, oh yes, there was something here before. People have memories of that. I was just thinking, coming to this studio, right? I still think of it as the Altman's store.
Yeah.
And, people have these kind of ghost memories of buildings. And, you don't have to be here for very long to experience that sense of loss that goes with things changing. I mean, I've talked to people who've been here 2 weeks, and the place they like to get coffee for the last 2 weeks is closed and something else is there. It's like the city is ruined for them. And that sense of constantly negotiating with the past and being aware of it, we have these tensions in the city. People who want to preserve, the things because they're always very aware of all the things that are being lost all the time, and then people who want to really participate in the excitement of constant change. But really, most people are kind of in both of those camps at the same time. We all kind of recognize that you get attached to things and you want them to be there, but they can't stay there forever. And others who, understand that the city needs to change, but so much of why people come here has to do with its history, and you don't want to lose that. So that kind of constant push and pull is part of the character of the city as much as the old things that have stayed intact.
Of course. We're talking to Justin Davidson about his book, Magnetic City, and I was fascinated. There were seven, is it, walking tours that you can take and follow, and as I said earlier, this is not just about a tour about how to get around the city, but well thought out in terms of not only places to go, but what's there and what was there and what it means. And I think I was fascinated most by the tour of Harlem and the South Bronx.
Well, you're from the Bronx, right?
Yeah. Edgecombe Avenue, Grand Concourse. I had never thought about that. Talk about that, those spots and that history.
Well, So I should explain that this is not walking tours about like, where to shop or where to
Right,
eat.
right.
And it really doesn't include most of the monuments of New York. It's about,
Thankfully.
yeah, it's really about, it's a set of 7 stories about how the city developed. So I wanted each itinerary to tell a story in chronological order. And so each one is different in terms of the aspect of New York and of living here that it deals with. That particular one was about 2 different neighborhoods which were really built on a certain version of the American dream.
For African Americans on the one side,
Right.
and for Jews on the other.
Exactly. And the part of Harlem that I deal with was called Sugar Hill, which is, a high area above the bluffs overlooking the Harlem River. Down below were the polo fields and the Harlem Speedway. Now there's a set of housing projects down there. But its position on this cliff made it a place for really the African American aristocracy of talent and status, especially during the Harlem Renaissance. And
Sort of embodied by 409
yeah,
Edgecombe.
409 Edgecombe Avenue, which is a tallish building along Edgecombe Avenue where Duke Ellington lived and Thurgood Marshall lived and William White, the head of the NAACP. It was every floor had a different amazingly distinguished member of society, and they contributed a lot. And really directly across the river, you can practically see it, is this part of the Grand Concourse, which is a magnet for Jews moving up out of the Lower East Side and into, realizing the aspirations of a whole, immigrant and second generation group that found a way to. It was a kind of promised land for a while. And it was really built, the Grand Concourse was built as a great Parisian-style boulevard and designed by a French engineer and architect, Louis Ries. And that idea that you see embedded in the city, these dreams of social aspirations, there's some tragedy in that both of those areas really sort of met their limits and then went downhill.
As you point out, and maybe we should take a step back. You were drawn to this, you say, because by the opening of the reopening of High Bridge, which
Right.
you call the most romantic bridge in the city. I was fascinated by that.
What's amazing about this story is this bridge has always been there. It was a pedestrian bridge that was created because it was basically a platform on top of an aqueduct. It was part of the water system, bringing water in from the Croton Reservoir into the holding tank, which is the High Bridge Tower on the Manhattan side, and then bringing it down and distributing it through the network of aqueducts into the city. This was closed in the 70s because it basically became a hangout for drug dealers and the city didn't want to maintain it. Eventually, a few years ago, it was restored and reopened.
Mm-hmm.
And it's now this amazing, just purely pedestrian bridge overlooking the river with these enormous vistas of both the Bronx and Manhattan and all the roadways, the Major Deeg and all the roadways below. It's high up above the river. But what really struck me was that you think of that part of the South Bronx and that part of Harlem as really being quite separate until all of a sudden this bridge opens and you can walk across from one to the other. There were always other bridges, but in order to get to these points, you had to kind of go around over the McCombs Dam Bridge and past Yankee Stadium and do this detour. This suddenly made it so that these two neighborhoods are a few minutes apart on foot or by bike. And the ability to connect those two things, even though that bridge was always there, and there's a famous lithograph of Edgar Allan Poe walking across it from his house in the Bronx into Manhattan. But the reopening of that bridge somehow changed the geography of the city, the mental geography. And that's something that you see happening a lot in New York, where some little change somehow affects the way people think of how to get around and what they're close to and where they're going. And it's one of those characteristic things about New York that it doesn't have a clear center. And so all of the pieces of it kind of are constantly shifting in terms of people's sense of its importance and where they go to work and what their commuting patterns are. The mental geography of the city is more fluid than the physical geography.
Yeah. And going back to what you said a minute ago about the social aspirations of these two groups of people, the African Americans in Harlem and the Jews moving up out of the Lower East Side to the Grand Concourse, you see, as you said before, you didn't think of these two communities as having something related, and now a bridge opens and your mind gets open to this. And these two these two areas on a hill weren't representative of the folks down below. They were having a tough time in the lower part of, down below where the projects are now in Harlem, and down below and where towards Yankee Stadium and all. And that played a part, I think you say, in how those aspirations were dashed in the tragic end of those neighborhoods. They rose and they ended pretty quickly.
Yeah, they're both those sort of apex of the apex, right? There's a physical apex. They're both kind of sitting high on ridges. And then there's this moment that they both had at different times. And they're sort of these dreams, right? They're these moments in the history of New York where some of these aspirations were really, for a little while, realized for some people. And even though it meant that lots of other people didn't realize those, and maybe those dreams were to some extent realized at the expense of some other people. Mm-hmm. And then in both cases, it kind of came to an end. And they came to an end largely for economic reasons and reasons of race relations. And now in both of those areas, what you see is trying to bring that back. And there are these two really exceptional moments and places in New York that both experienced this fall off. And now you see the incremental, slow and difficult process of trying to knit both of those communities back into a prosperous city. And in both cases, they're taking different paths, but those are difficult things to do. Yeah. And once again, you see those dreams kind of kicking back in, and one person's dream is another person's incursion. So it's never easy because to some extent, real estate in this city, and that's, yeah, runs right through the book. Real estate is a zero-sum game. If somebody is improving their life in one place, it may be making it worse for somebody else nearby. Well,
as you say, the founding document of New York is the real estate deal in the first story, which is about what the real estate folks now call FIDI, but Lower Manhattan, where we began. Let's talk about, that was about money. That was about the Dutch and money and real estate.
Yeah. New York, I think of money as being kind of the sap of New York, the juice that nourishes it. And it's really hard to understand anything about the development, the growth, the changes in New York without understanding how the money moves through the city. And that tour of the financial district is really a tour of both the oldest and the newest part of New York, because it's the oldest part in that that's where the Dutch first settled. So you can see traces and locations of that early settlement. And you can understand the way, for instance, the city's geography changed because the shores of the city moved out through mm-hmm. landfill out into the river. So that the tip of Manhattan is much fatter, much wider now than it was then. And you can kind of see exactly how the city has moved. But it's also an area that's recently changed in that what was a business district has become largely a residential district. And
very expensive condos and rentals. There's the Gehry, that huge Gehry building on Frank Gehry on Spruce Street.
Yeah.
What do you think of that building with the sort of crinkly?
Well, I think that it's there's a kind of Gehry decoration to what is really fundamentally a fairly conventional rental tower. Most of it is really basically similar to any other tower, and then it kind of gets its Gehry-esque style from this facade, which is really very well done and quite interesting. But it's trying to fit that idea of style into what is always true in New York, which is that the leeway for architecture is really quite narrow, because the city absorbs all of these individual ideas into its grid, into its rules, into the density of the urban fabric. So it's hard to really do something that goes against that, except kind of around the edges in small ways.
I'll mention some other tours so we give the audience a further idea what's in the book. One is called Liquid City, which involves the seaport and Governor's Island, which if you haven't been there lately, that's a whole different place. The Brooklyn waterfront, where Herman Melville was, well, at least near where Herman Melville comes from. The Imagination Playground, David Rockwell. You talk about that. Some of the other tours of the High Line, the Upper West Side. I'm interested in your thoughts about, we were just talking about architecture, and we see now in the city this, what appears to be this, I'll call it phallic competition among developers, like mine is bigger than yours, and we're going to build a tower. My tower is, we got 432 Park Avenue, which is, it's my view, I'm not an architecture critic, but abominable. But, we got that 100 stories or whatever it is on Park Avenue. We got West 57th Street. What do you make of that?
One of the interesting things about doing this book and looking into the history of the city is how constant these complaints and these arguments are throughout the entire history of the city.
Yeah.
So, Henry James leaves, he's a native New Yorker, he leaves New York at the end of the 19th century, goes to Europe for 20 years or so, comes back in 1905, and he's crossing the harbor after taking the ship back in to the States. He's crossing New York Harbor, and his first view of New York is looking at Lower Manhattan from a ship that's crossing, a ferry that's crossing the harbor. And he is appalled because the tallest building in Manhattan is now no longer Trinity Church. Now, Trinity Church today is completely enclosed in buildings that are much higher than the ones he was upset to see. He was looking at the very first generation of skyscrapers, which to us today are kind of relatively short buildings. And he's appalled that money should be driving the skyline instead of the sort of spiritual beacon of the church.
Aesthetics.
What's appalling us now is that a different kind of money is driving the skyline. So instead of office towers, we're seeing residential buildings. And office towers have always engaged in that kind of competition that you were talking about. I mean, 40 Wall Street and the Chrysler Building were in this deathly competition around 1930 to be the tallest
I think you point out it started with the Flatiron Building, 1902.
Yeah, I mean, there have always been these aspirations to be the tallest thing around. And of course, you get that trophy and it doesn't last for very long. And 432 Park is going to be overshadowed quite soon by several other buildings. It's not going to be the tallest building in Midtown for long. The Nordstrom building, which is going to be considerably, taller than anything else around, is under construction now. So what's changed, I think, is that some of these buildings in Midtown they're not just residential buildings, but they're very thin, narrow buildings for a very small number of apartments. So whereas previously office towers like the Empire State Building had a life that was full of thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people who came and went every day and who were part of the economic engine of the city, now we're talking about a very tall tower that may have, up at the top, like one apartment every 2 floors and often unoccupied.
Right.
So the number of people
They're investments. People
Yeah.
don't
So the
live
number
there.
of people who are having an effect, a very small number of people are having a disproportionate effect on the skyline. And that's something new.
I wanted to further that conversation. We only have about a minute and a half, 2 minutes left, with your thoughts about how much glass, we have glass and steel towers by and large, and your thoughts about how that can be counter-aesthetic, if that's a word, to what we're hoping to see in the city.
I don't have a problem with glass as an architectural material. The problem that I have is with glass in its most basic form as a default architectural material, where pretty much you know what every tower is going to look like, because the
Right.
economic calculations that make you put up a glass curtain wall tower are always pretty much the same. What I hope we will see, and we're starting to see, is a return of some of the historic materials that have always been part of the New York fabric in high-rises: terracotta, copper, stone. We have skyscrapers that are clad in all these materials, and they create a kind of texture and shadow that's precious to New York. And I think we're starting to see some of that come back, but they're still sort of luxury materials.
We may see what you're hoping for in the design for what's going to replace, or how the Domino Sugar Factory out in Brooklyn is going to evolve. Apparently, they're keeping the old brick facade and putting a glass thing inside. And
Yeah, I mean, that to me is a good use of glass, which is to create a building inside an existing building, and the building inside has its own rationale, but it preserves the kind of history, the sense of time passing that other materials can do. Glass looks the same no matter how old it is until it stops working, and then you replace it.
yeah.
It doesn't age.
We're talking with Justin Davidson. We've been talking about his new book, Magnetic City. There's so much more in that book that you will find fascinating about the history of New York, the stories of New York, and why New York is the way it is. And Justin Davidson, I thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.